Good evening, everyone. My name's Chris Wood, and I have the great pleasure of being one of the vice presidents at the Santa Fe Institute. And on behalf of the entire SFI community and our president, Jerry Sabloff, who's traveling this evening, I wish you greetings, Happy New Year, and welcome to the first in our 2010 series of public lectures. Those of you who've attended these lectures in the past know that they're widely varied. Each one is both broad and deep and exciting on a new topic from month to month. It's my great pleasure also to acknowledge tonight the important support that we receive from local underwriters toward support for the public lecture series. In particular, I want to call attention this evening to the Los Alamos National Bank and their president and CEO, Bill Enlow, for their underwriting support for the entire series throughout the entire year. And I also want to acknowledge Trevor Hawkins and the Southwest Care Center for their particular support in underwriting tonight's lecture. Thank you. And as you also saw, if you were watching the slides that were going by slowly earlier, there are opportunities for underwriting throughout the remainder of the year. And if you have an interest of that sort, please grab me after the lecture tonight, or Ginger Richardson, who is our Vice President for Education and is responsible for organizing the entire set of lectures throughout the year. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Lauren Ansel Myers from the University of Texas at Austin. Lauren is a distinguished mathematical biologist, and we at Santa Fe Institute are proud to be able to call her one of us. She is both an external professor at the Institute now and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute earlier in the preceding decade. Lauren received her bachelor's degree from Harvard in mathematics and in philosophy, and her PhD from Stanford in biology. She's one of the premier mathematical biologists in the country and the world today, and we think that you will very much enjoy and profit from hearing her lecture this evening. Lauren, it's a great pleasure to introduce you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Chris. I have spent much time in Santa Fe over the last decade, and the Santa Fe Institute Public Lecture Series has been a highlight of many of those visits, and I'm really honored to be your speaker tonight and to share a little bit about some of the work we've been doing since April to help the federal government and local governments figure out what's going on with this new strain of flu and how best to control it. Now I'm going to peek around and see if there's a pointer. Oh, here we go. Okay. And my ulterior motive tonight is to tell you actually how math has helped in this endeavor without actually showing you any equations. So let me get started. So this is an overview of what we're going to do tonight. First, I'm going to tell you some basics of flu. You're probably all much more educated about flu now than you were at this time last year because of H1N1, but I'm going to tell you what I think are some important fundamentals. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of mathematical modeling in infectious disease and how we've used math in the past. And then move on to some more modern methods that were partly developed at the Santa Fe Institute and how these have been used recently to address questions like how fast does H1N1 spread, which age groups are at risk for H1N1, and who should be vaccinated. And finally, I'm going to talk about some very, very recent methods that we've developed just in the last 6 to 12 months that help us figure out how best to use limited resources in trying to control diseases, and specifically how we've applied these methods to address the question, how should we deploy our strategic national stockpile of antiviral medications? So let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about flu. So flu, as you know, is a major public health burden. In a normal flu year, we have a regular seasonal epidemic. Hundreds of thousands of people are typically hospitalized because of flu, and tens of thousands of people actually die every year in the U.S. from flu. And it's a tricky virus. If you get infected one year, you may be immune for a short period of time, but because the virus is so quickly evolving, you'll probably be vulnerable again a few years later. And this is why every year we have to come up with a new vaccine, because the virus is constantly changing. Occasionally, however, we get a very new strain introduced into the human population that looks nothing like the strains that have been circulating in previous years. And the way this typically happens is that there's lots of strains regularly circulating in wild waterfowl populations, like duck populations, that have never been introduced or never really spread in human populations. Occasionally, one of these will get introduced into a domesticated livestock population, like a pig population or a poultry population. And if we're really unlucky, it takes hold and starts spreading through these animal populations. And if we're really, really unlucky, it then gets introduced from these poultry or swine populations into humans and starts spreading among humans. To our knowledge, this occurred 3 times in the 20th century, and whenever this occurs, it's called a pandemic. Many of you are probably familiar with the most notorious of these pandemics, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. It was caused by another strain of H1N1, and what you see here in this graph is just the years in the 20th century, and this is estimates of how many people died from flu in the state of Maine. So you can see there's a huge spike in 1918. Worldwide, it's estimated that somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died that season from the Spanish flu, that new H1N1. The next pandemic of the 20th century, the next new strain to appear from birds, was the Asian flu. It appeared in 1957. It was much milder. And when it appeared, it completely displaced H1N1. It completely displaced H1N1. Okay, so we don't know exactly why this happened. This appeared, and we never see H1N1 again. And just to be clear, what happened after this year is this strain came back year after year, slightly evolved, descendants of this H1N1, much, much milder, year after year caused seasonal epidemics, and then it disappears when this new pandemic is introduced. 1968, we get our next pandemic strain. It's numbered H3N2. It's also called the Hong Kong flu. And as with the previous pandemic, it completely replaced the existing strain. So H2N2 caused seasonal epidemics year after year between 57 and 68. It's replaced in 68 with H3N2. Since then, there's been a lot of activity on the flu front. So those are our 3 pandemics of the 20th century. In 1976, we had a swine flu scare. There were a handful of cases at Fort Dix military base in New Jersey. Several hundred people were infected. Somewhere between 5 and 25 people died from that flu, but it never escaped the military base. It never started spreading widely in the population. I mention it, though, because that year, because of the scare, Gerald Ford decided to mount a universal vaccination campaign, which went awry. It turned out that there was possibly some complications due to this vaccine, and after about 40 million people had become vaccinated, they stopped vaccination because it had been linked to an autoimmune disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome. In fact, that vaccination campaign may have been unnecessary because that strain never actually spread from person to person and disappeared shortly after it appeared in Fort Dix. 1977, we had a reintroduction of H1N1. It was a strain that looked very much like the H1N1 that was around, that was spreading around 1950. We believe that this was introduced into the human population as a lab escapee from a lab that was probably in China near the Russian border, but it's been called the Russian flu because we saw a lot of cases early on in Russia. And for some reason, when we had this reintroduction of H1N1 in 1977, it did not displace the currently spreading strain. And since 1977, we have had a combination of H3N2 and H1N1 causing our seasonal epidemics. So until this year, that's what we saw. Descendants of this Hong Kong flu and descendants of the Russian flu causing our seasonal epidemics. In 1997, was the beginning of the bird flu scare. So there's this strain that's been in the media quite a bit until this year, until H1N1 grabbed our attention, called H5N1. It's a strain that's caused large-scale outbreaks in poultry farms and occasionally infects individual humans who are exposed to infected birds. This strain, fortunately, has not gained the ability to spread from human to human, so these are always isolated cases. Unfortunately, however, this appears to be a very virulent strain. More than half the people who have been diagnosed with this have actually died from it. That's a fatality rate much higher than we've ever seen for any flu, including the 1918 flu. But hopefully, it won't ever gain the ability to spread from human to human. This, however, is why the national, international, local governments have been planning for about the last decade for the next pandemic. They've been worried that this strain or a strain like it would be introduced into the human population and they'd have to do something serious to combat it. And that's equipped us to be able to deal with today's pandemic, the H1N1 strain that appeared in April of 2020.